I have always believed that the most terrifying thing about the deep wilderness is not the possibility of being eaten by a bear or falling down a hidden ravine, but rather the sudden and chilling realization that you are not as alone as you previously thought. My name is Elias, and last October, I decided to take a solo 5-day trek through the most remote sections of the Olympic Peninsula, a place where the trees are so thick with moss that they seem to swallow every sound you make before it can even leave your lips. By the third day of my journey, I was deep within the backcountry, miles away from the nearest established trailhead and feeling a profound sense of peace that only comes from total isolation from the modern world. I spent my afternoon setting up a small, discreet camp near a trickling stream and decided to spend the evening reviewing the photographs I had taken on my digital camera throughout the trip so far. The sun was beginning to dip below the jagged horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the forest floor as I sat on a flat rock and began scrolling through the digital display of my Nikon. At first, the images were exactly what I expected, featuring sprawling vistas of mist-covered valleys and close-up shots of rare alpine flowers that I had found along the ridges. However, as I clicked back to the photos from the previous night, my heart didn't just skip a beat. It felt as though it had been gripped by a hand of solid ice because there, on the small glowing screen, was a photo of me. It wasn't a selfie or a timed shot that I had forgotten about, but a perfectly framed, clear image of myself lying deep in sleep inside my sleeping bag, taken from an angle that could only have been achieved by someone standing directly over my tent opening while I was unconscious. My breath hitched in my throat as I frantically scrolled to the next image, finding another shot of my boots sitting outside the tent, and then another of the back of my head while I was filtering water at the stream. Earlier that very morning, the realization hit me like a physical blow that someone had been moving through the brush behind me for over 24 hours, watching my every move and even venturing close enough to touch my gear while I slept. I looked up from the camera, my eyes darting wildly into the darkening woods, but the forest was unnervingly still and the silence was now a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to amplify the frantic pounding of my own blood in my ears. I knew I couldn't stay in that spot, but the sun had already vanished, leaving me in a world of deep purple shadows where every twisted root looked like a reaching hand and every rustle of the wind sounded like a footstep. I forced myself to move with a calculated calmness, packing my essentials into my bag while keeping my head on a swivel, wondering if the person who took those photos was watching me at this exact moment from the dense tree-line just 20 feet away. Why hadn't they attacked me while I was sleeping? And what kind of person spends their time documenting a stranger's journey through the woods without ever making their presence known? As the last of the natural light faded into a pitch-black night, I clicked on my headlamp, the narrow beam of light cutting through the darkness and revealing only the endless columns of ancient hemlock trees. I decided to hike through the night, believing that movement was my only defense, but as I began to trek back toward the main trail, I heard a sound that made my skin crawl. The faint, unmistakable metallic click of a camera shutter coming from the darkness behind me. I didn't scream, though every nerve in my body was begging me to do so, because I knew that showing fear would only embolden whoever was stalking me through the labyrinth of the forest. I increased my pace, my lungs burning as I pushed myself up a steep, switchback incline. But no matter how fast I moved, I could feel those unseen eyes boring into the back of my neck. Every few minutes, I would spin around and sweep my light across the woods, hoping to catch a glimpse of a reflective jacket or the glint of a lens, but there was only the shifting shadows and the oppressive weight of the mountain. I began to wonder if I was being led toward a trap, or if this predator was simply enjoying the process of watching me unravel in the dark, waiting for the perfect moment of exhaustion to finally close the distance. The hours blurred into a waking nightmare as I navigated by the dim glow of my GPS, my mind racing with questions about who this person could be and why they were targeting a lone hiker in such a calculated and patient manner. Around midnight, I reached a rocky outcrop that offered a slight vantage point, and for a brief second, I turned off my headlamp to see if I could spot another light source following me. The darkness was absolute, a total sensory deprivation that made me feel like I was floating in an empty void, until I heard a soft, rhythmic breathing just a few feet below the ledge where I stood. My hands shook as I fumbled for my bare spray, my thumb hovering over the safety trigger, realizing that the stalker had anticipated my route and had managed to get ahead of me in the total blackness of the night. I whispered a plea into the dark, asking what they wanted from me, but the only response was the sound of fabric rubbing against bark and the distant, haunting cry of an owl. I realized then that I wasn't dealing with a typical hiker or even a common thief, but someone who knew these woods with a terrifying intimacy and who viewed me as nothing more than a subject in a sick, twisted game. I knew I had to do something drastic to break the cycle of the hunt, so I threw my heavy backpack down the opposite side of the ridge, hoping the crashing sound would serve as a decoy while I scrambled into a narrow crevice in the rocks. I pressed my back against the cold stone, holding my breath until my chest ached, watching as a dark, hooded figure emerged from the trees and moved toward the sound of my fallen bag. The figure moved with a strange, fluid grace, never using a light of their own, and I watched in silent horror as they reached the bag and realized it was empty of its owner. They stood perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, their head tilting to the side as if they were listening for the sound of my heartbeat, and I saw the silhouette of a long, professional camera lens hanging around their neck like a trophy. I waited until they began to descend after the bag, and then I sprinted in the opposite direction, abandoning my gear and running with a desperate, primal energy that I didn't know I possessed. I didn't follow the trails anymore, knowing they were watched, and instead I scrambled through the thickest brush and thorns, ignoring the branches that tore at my skin and clothes. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the canopy, I had reached the paved road that led to the ranger station, my body trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and pure, unadulterated relief. I didn't stop running until I saw the headlights of a park patrol vehicle, flagging them down with such frantic desperation that the officer nearly pulled his weapon before realizing I was a victim. I told them everything, showing them the photos on my camera which I had luckily kept in my pocket, and I watched as the officer's face turned a pale shade of white as he looked at the images of me sleeping. They searched the area for days, finding my abandoned backpack and a series of blind spots where someone had set up long-term observation posts, but the photographer was never found. I still hike, but I never go alone, and I never, ever look through my photos until I am safely back within the walls of my own home. I have spent most of my adult life seeking out the kind of silence that you can only find at 12,000 feet, where the air is thin enough to make your head swim and the world below looks like a distant, toy-sized memory. Last August, I set out to conquer a forgotten pass in the northern reaches of the Bitterroot Mountains, a place so rugged and unforgiving that the maps often come with warnings about the lack of reliable water and the absolute absence of any cell service. I had been hiking for 3 days, my legs feeling like lead but my spirit soaring as I crossed a narrow, swaying suspension bridge that spanned a terrifyingly deep gorge, unaware that as soon as my boots hit the other side, I was stepping into a nightmare that had been carefully prepared for someone just like me. I reached my planned campsite on a high, rocky shelf just as a biting wind began to howl through the granite peaks, and I spent an hour securing my tent with heavy stones, feeling a strange sense of unease that I couldn't quite put into words. The trouble began the next morning when I decided to backtrack a few miles to retrieve a water filtration kit I thought I had left near the gorge, only to find that the suspension bridge, a massive structure of thick cable and heavy timber, was gone. It hadn't collapsed under the weight of the wind or snapped due to age. Instead, as I knelt at the edge of the abyss, I saw the clean, silver glint of fresh saw marks on the remaining wooden pilings, indicating that someone had intentionally cut the bridge to ensure that whoever was on the other side could not return to the civilization of the trailhead. My heart began to race with a cold, sharp panic as I realized I was effectively trapped on a high-altitude island of rock and ice, with the only other way down being a treacherous, unmarked scramble that would take days and likely end in a fatal fall. I stood there in the deafening silence of the mountains, staring at the severed cables, when I noticed a movement on the far side of the canyon. A group of 3 men dressed in mismatched camouflage, standing perfectly still and watching me with the detached curiosity of hunters observing a trapped animal in a cage. I didn't wait to see if they had a way across or if they intended to speak. I turned and ran back toward my camp, my breath coming in ragged, painful gasps as the thin air fought against my lungs. I knew that if they had cut the bridge, they had a reason for wanting me stuck on this side of the mountain, and my only hope was to find a place to hide before the sun went down and the true hunt began. As I reached my campsite, I found that my tent had been ransacked, my food supplies were gone, and my GPS device had been smashed into 100 pieces on a flat rock, leaving me with nothing but the clothes on my back and a small pocket knife. The sun began to sink behind the jagged teeth of the mountains, casting the valley into a deep, bruised purple, and I knew that staying in the open was a death sentence, so I began to climb higher, toward the shadows of a boulder field where I hoped the jagged terrain would hide my silhouette. Night fell with a brutal intensity, the temperature dropping so fast that my breath turned into thick clouds of white vapor that seemed to hang in the air like ghosts. I found a narrow crevice between two massive slabs of granite and squeezed inside, pulling a handful of dried moss and dirt over my legs to insulate myself against the killing frost. From my hiding spot, I could see the faint, rhythmic sweep of high-powered flashlights moving across the plateau below me, the beams of light cutting through the darkness like searchlights in a prison yard. These men weren't park rangers or search and rescue teams. They moved with a tactical precision that suggested they had done this many times before, and the way they communicated with low, guttural whistles made my blood run cold with the realization that I was being tracked by people who saw the mountain as their private killing floor. The tension of the night was a physical weight, every crack of a freezing rock or shift of the wind sounding like a footstep approaching my hiding place. And I spent hours staring into the darkness until my eyes began to play tricks on me. Around 3 in the morning, the light beams stopped moving, and for a long time, there was nothing but the sound of the wind, until I heard a voice, cold, calm, and terrifyingly close, whisper that they knew I couldn't stay hidden forever because the cold would eventually force me out. I realized then that they weren't just looking for me. They were waiting for me to break, playing a psychological game designed to exhaust my will to live before they ever laid a hand on me. I gripped my small knife, my knuckles white and my body shivering uncontrollably, knowing that if I stayed in that crevice until dawn, I would be too frozen to move and too weak to fight back. I decided to use the darkness to my advantage, remembering a narrow, dangerous animal trail I had seen earlier that skirted the very edge of the eastern cliffs, a path so thin that even a mountain goat would hesitate to use it. I crawled out of my hiding spot on my hands and knees, moving with agonizing slowness to avoid sending any loose pebbles cascading down the slope, and began to navigate the cliffside by touch alone. The drop to my right was an endless void of blackness, and one wrong step would mean a silent fall into the rocks thousands of feet below. But the threat of the men behind me was far more terrifying than the threat of the heights. I could hear them calling out to each other now, their voices sounding frustrated as they realized I was no longer in the boulder field, and the beams of their lights began to dance wildly across the rocks as they scrambled to find my trail. I reached a section of the cliff where the path narrowed to barely 6 inches, and I had to press my chest against the freezing stone, shuffling sideways while my fingers bled from gripping the sharp edges of the granite. Just as I rounded a corner, a flashlight beam swept over the rock face just inches above my head, and I froze, my heart hammering so loudly against the stone that I was sure they could hear it. The light lingered for an eternity, illuminating the spray of gravel falling into the abyss. But then it moved on, the men convinced that no human would be insane enough to attempt the cliff path in total darkness. I used that moment of doubt to push forward, eventually finding a steep, hidden chimney in the rock that allowed me to slide down toward a lower timberline, far away from the plateau where the hunters were still searching. By the time the sun finally began to peek over the horizon, I had made it to a secondary trail that led toward a distant fire lookout tower, my body a map of bruises and cuts, but my mind focused on survival. I reached the tower just as the morning mist was clearing, and the lookout on duty immediately saw my condition and called for an emergency extraction, his face twisting in horror as I described the men and the severed bridge. The authorities later discovered a hidden compound tucked into a cave system near the gorge, a place filled with the stolen gear of dozens of hikers who had disappeared over the years, proving that I had escaped a fate far worse than a simple accident. I never returned to the Bitterroots, and sometimes, when the wind howls at night, I can still hear the low, guttural whistles of the men who believe the mountains belong only to them. The most dangerous thing you can carry into the wilderness is the blind assumption that the trail beneath your feet was placed there by someone who actually wants you to find your way home. I learned this lesson in the suffocating heat of the Ozark backcountry, a region where the limestone bluffs look like ancient, rotting teeth, and the dense canopy of oak and hickory trees can turn a bright afternoon into a murky, green twilight in a matter of seconds. I was 6 miles into a loop that was supposed to be a simple day hike, following a series of bright red paint blazes on the trees that indicated the path toward the valley floor. However, after an hour of descending a slope that felt far steeper than the topographic map had suggested, I came to a dead stop because the red paint on the trunk of a massive white oak was still wet to the touch. My fingers came away stained a deep, arterial crimson, and as I looked down the trail, I realized that the red blazes didn't lead toward the valley at all, but instead veered sharply toward the edge of a jagged limestone quarry that had been abandoned for decades. I turned around to backtrack, only to find that the markers I had followed to get here were gone, or rather, they had been hastily covered with clumps of mud and dead leaves that were now sliding off the bark to reveal the true, blue-painted trail that led in the opposite direction. Someone had been moving just minutes ahead of me, painting a false trail to lure me away from the safety of the main path and toward the sheer, crumbling cliffs of the quarry. The silence that followed this realization was deafening, broken only by the sound of a heavy branch snapping somewhere in the thicket behind me, followed by a low, rhythmic thud that sounded like someone beating a heavy stick against a hollow log. I began to move back toward the blue markers, my heart slamming against my ribs like a trapped bird, but every time I thought I had found the correct path, I would find another false red blaze fresh and dripping on a nearby tree. It was as if the forest itself was being rewritten in real time, a labyrinth of wet paint and deception designed to keep me circling the same half-mile radius until the sun finally dipped below the ridge. I realized with a jolt of pure terror that I wasn't just lost. I was being herded like livestock into a specific corner of the woods where the terrain was the most treacherous and the visibility was the lowest. As the light began to fail, a thick, damp fog rolled off the limestone cliffs, swirling around the trees and making it impossible to see more than 10 feet in any direction. I decided to stop moving altogether, fearing that every step was taking me closer to whatever trap had been set, and I climbed into the low branches of a sturdy cedar tree to gain some elevation and perspective. From my perch, I watched the forest floor through the gloom, and my blood turned to ice when I saw a figure emerge from the fog, carrying a long pole with a brush attached to the end and a bucket of that same sickeningly bright red paint. This person wasn't a monster or a ghost, but a man dressed in tattered work clothes with a face that looked as weathered and indifferent as the stones of the quarry. He didn't look angry or even particularly hurried. He simply moved from tree to tree, methodically painting new blazes that formed a perfect circle around the base of the cedar where I was hiding. The psychological weight of watching him trap me in a ring of red was almost more than I could bear, and I had to bite my lip to keep from screaming as he passed directly beneath my branch, the smell of cheap turpentine and old sweat rising up to meet me. He stopped for a moment, his head tilting up as if he could sense my warmth or hear the frantic thudding of my heart, and he let out a low, wet chuckle that made my skin crawl with a primal sense of revulsion. He spent the next 3 hours pacing that circle in the dark, occasionally tapping his wooden pole against the trunks of the trees, a sound that echoed through the foggy night like the ticking of a clock counting down the minutes of my life. I knew that if I stayed in the tree until morning, he would eventually find me, but if I climbed down in the dark, I would be blind in the fog and at the mercy of a man who knew every inch of this deceptive landscape. Around midnight, a sudden, heavy downpour began to lash the forest, the rain coming down in sheets that blurred the world into a chaotic mess of gray and silver. I realized this was my only chance, as the heavy rain would wash away the wet paint and mask the sound of my movement. So I slid down the trunk of the cedar and hit the muddy ground with a soft splash. I didn't look for markers anymore. Instead, I pulled out my compass and focused solely on a due north heading, knowing that if I could just maintain a straight line, I would eventually hit the gravel logging road that marked the edge of the park. I moved through the brush like a phantom, the rain soaking me to the bone and the wind whipping my hair across my face, but I never stopped, even when I heard a frustrated, high-pitched shout echoing from the direction of the red circle. The man was hunting for me now, his methodical pace replaced by a frantic, heavy crashing through the undergrowth as he realized his subject had escaped the pen. I could see the dim, flickering light of a lantern swinging through the trees behind me, the yellow glow looking like a predatory eye searching for a target in the storm. I reached a small creek that had turned into a rushing torrent of brown water, and I threw my bright orange rain cover into the current, watching as it was swept away toward the south. I then waded into the freezing water and walked upstream for 100 yards, hiding behind a fallen log just as the man with the lantern reached the bank where I had stood. He saw the orange fabric disappearing down the river and let out a guttural cry of triumph, sprinting along the muddy bank in pursuit of what he thought was his fleeing victim. I waited until his light had vanished into the distance before I climbed out of the water and continued my trek north, my muscles screaming and my breath coming in jagged, freezing gasps. By the time the sun began to rise over the misty hills, I stumbled out onto the gravel road, my clothes torn and my hands stained with a mixture of mud and the faint, lingering traces of red paint. A local delivery truck driver found me an hour later, huddled on the side of the road, and he told me that I was the third hiker this year to come out of those woods talking about a man with a paintbrush. The local police searched the area but found only a stash of empty paint cans and a collection of maps where every trail had been meticulously crossed out and replaced with a series of red circles. I never go hiking in the Ozarks anymore, and to this day, the smell of fresh house paint is enough to send me into a cold, shaking panic.